In the fading light of a kingdom torn asunder by a century of relentless warfare, when hope had become a distant memory for the French people and their uncrowned king cowered behind the Loire River, something extraordinary was about to unfold. The year was 1429. England controlled Paris, dominated most of northern France, and their Burgundian allies held sway over the eastern territories. The Dauphin, mockingly called the King of Bourges, ruled over territory that shrank with each passing season, while his own nobles whispered doubts about whether he was even the legitimate heir to the throne. France wasn't merely losing a war, it was dissolving like morning mist, ceasing to exist as a unified kingdom. Yet in this darkest hour, from the most unlikely of places, would emerge one of history's most extraordinary figures. Not a seasoned general hardened by decades of warfare. Not a powerful duke commanding vast armies. Not a learned theologian capable of rallying the church to France's defense. But a 17-year-old peasant girl who could neither read nor write, who had never held a sword or worn armor, who had spent her childhood tending sheep and spinning wool in an obscure village on the eastern frontier. What unfolded over the next 2 years defies every expectation we might hold about medieval society, about military strategy, about the very nature of faith itself. This illiterate teenager would convince a desperate king to entrust her with an army. She would lift a 7-month siege in just 9 days. She would crown a king in enemy territory. She would be captured, tried for heresy, and burned at the stake before her 20th birthday. And somehow, through all of this, she would save France and alter the course of European history. This is not a tale of gradual transformation or steady progress. This is the story of a lightning strike that illuminated an entire kingdom, burned with impossible brightness, and was extinguished almost as quickly as it had appeared. Yet its light would never truly die, echoing through 6 centuries to inspire revolutionaries and reactionaries, feminists and traditionalists, believers and skeptics alike. To understand Joan of Arc, we must first understand the France into which she was born. We must grasp the depth of the crisis that made her mission necessary, the religious world that shaped her visions, and the political machinery that would first elevate and then destroy her. We must see through the eyes of those who followed her into battle, those who condemned her to death, and those who would spend the next 500 years trying to explain what had happened in those 2 extraordinary years. Tonight, as we journey through this remarkable saga, we will encounter kings and peasants, saints and sinners, voices from heaven, and the flames of execution. We will witness military strategies that shouldn't have worked but did, theological arguments that determine the fate of nations, and political betrayals that echo with shame across the centuries. We will see how a teenage girl's absolute conviction collided with the cynical realities of medieval power, and how, against all odds, her faith proved stronger than their politics. But before we can meet the Maid of Orleans, before we can hear her voices or follow her banner into battle, we must first understand the 100-year tragedy that made her necessary. We must witness the slow collapse of the greatest kingdom in Christendom, the civil war that tore it apart from within, and the moment when all seemed lost. Only then can we appreciate the full magnitude of what one young woman achieved in the face of impossible odds. The seeds of France's destruction were sown on a fog-shrouded morning in 1328 when Charles IV died without a male heir, ending the direct Cape-Town line that had ruled France for 3 centuries. What followed was not merely a succession dispute, but the beginning of a conflict that would consume generations, destroy entire provinces, and reduce the most powerful kingdom in Europe to the edge of annihilation. Edward III of England, grandson of Philip IV of France through his mother Isabella, claimed the French throne by right of blood. The French nobility, invoking the ancient Salic law that barred inheritance through the female line, crowned Philip VI of the House of Valois instead. It was a legal technicality that would cost hundreds of thousands of lives. At first, the conflict simmered rather than blazed. Edward III, occupied with Scottish wars and domestic concerns, initially accepted Philip VI's coronation. But when Philip attempted to confiscate England's valuable Duchy of Gascony in 1337, Edward reasserted his claim to the French throne, and the 100 Years' War began in earnest. No one could have imagined it would last until 1453, spanning 5 generations of kings and transforming both nations beyond recognition. The early decades of the war revealed a shocking truth that would haunt France for a century. Their traditional military superiority, based on heavily armored noble cavalry, was obsolete. At Crécy in 1346, English longbowmen slaughtered the flower of French chivalry, their arrows punching through expensive armor as if it were parchment. At Poitiers in 1356, the catastrophe was even worse. Not only was the French army destroyed, but King John II himself was captured, leaving France rudderless and humiliated. The capture of a king was more than a military defeat. It was a cosmic disruption of the natural order. Medieval society depended on the belief that God ordained social hierarchies, that kings ruled by divine right, that the strong protected the weak. When English archers, common men, peasants even, could destroy princes and capture kings, the very foundations of society trembled. France's agony was compounded by the Black Death, which arrived in 1348 and killed perhaps a third of the population. Entire villages vanished. Fields lay fallow. Trade routes collapsed. The survivors faced not only grief and fear but economic catastrophe as the traditional structures of rural life disintegrated. Peasant rebellions erupted across the kingdom, most notably the Jacquerie of 1358, when desperate farmers rose against nobles who had failed to protect them from either plague or English raiders. Meanwhile, companies of unemployed soldiers, the infamous free companies, roamed the countryside like packs of wolves. These route years, as they were called, were theoretically loyal to whoever paid them, but in practice they were loyal only to plunder. They besieged towns, burned villages, held nobles for ransom, and turned large swaths of France into lawless wastelands where only the strong or the hidden survived. By 1360, the Treaty of Bretigny seemed to offer respite. Edward III renounced his claim to the French throne in exchange for complete sovereignty over an enlarged Aquitaine. But peace was merely an intermission in the tragedy. Both kingdoms used the respite to rearm and prepare for the next act. When war resumed in 1369 under Edward's son, the Black Prince, and France's new king, Charles V, the conflict took on an even more bitter character. Charles V, known as the Wise, understood that France could not defeat England through traditional battlefield confrontations. Instead, he adopted a strategy of gradual attrition, avoiding major battles while slowly reclaiming territory through sieges and guerrilla warfare. His constable, Bertrand du Guesclin, perfected these tactics, refusing glorious cavalry charges in favor of patient, methodical warfare that gradually pushed the English back to a narrow strip along the coast. For a brief moment, it seemed France might recover. Charles V rebuilt the administration, reformed the tax system, and created a professional army. French confidence returned. The nightmare appeared to be ending. Then in 1380, everything fell apart again. Charles V died at only 42, leaving the throne to Charles VI, a boy of 11. What followed was a catastrophe that would make all previous French disasters seem mild by comparison. At first, the boy king's uncles ruled as regents, enriching themselves while the kingdom's finances collapsed. When Charles VI reached his majority and took personal control, there was brief hope for renewal. He was young, energetic, and determined to restore French glory. But in August 1392, while leading an expedition through the forest of Le Mans on a blazingly hot day, Charles VI suddenly went insane. He attacked his own men, killing 4 knights before being subdued. When he recovered, he couldn't remember what had happened. It was the beginning of a madness that would periodically incapacitate him for the rest of his life. The king's insanity created a power vacuum that 2 men rushed to fill: Louis, Duke of Orleans, the king's younger brother, and John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, the king's cousin. Their rivalry would tear France apart more thoroughly than any English invasion. Louis of Orleans was everything a medieval prince was supposed to be: handsome, cultured, a patron of the arts, and a legendary lover. He controlled the king during his lucid periods through charm and persuasion. John of Burgundy was his opposite: calculating, methodical, and pragmatic. He appealed to the merchants of Paris and the common people by promising reform and lower taxes. The rivalry between Orleans and Burgundy went beyond personal ambition. It represented two different visions of France. Orleans stood for the traditional monarchy, centralized and hierarchical. Burgundy represented a more federal vision with greater autonomy for the great duchies. Orleans drew his support from the south and center of France, Burgundy from the north and east. On the night of November 23, 1407, the conflict exploded into civil war. Louis of Orleans was returning from visiting the Queen when masked men emerged from the shadows of the Rue Vieille du Temple in Paris. They hacked him to pieces, leaving his mutilated body in the gutter. Within days, John the Fearless publicly admitted he had ordered the assassination, claiming he had acted to save France from a tyrant. The murder of Louis of Orleans split France into two irreconcilable factions: the Armagnacs, named after the Count of Armagnac, who led the Orleans party after Louis's death, and the Burgundians. What followed was not merely political rivalry, but genuine civil war. Armies marched and counter-marched across France. Paris changed hands repeatedly, each transfer accompanied by massacres of the opposing faction. The English, watching from across the Channel, could hardly believe their good fortune. Henry V of England, young, ambitious, and brilliantly opportunistic, invaded France in 1415, just as the Civil War reached its peak of savagery. The Armagnacs and Burgundians were so busy destroying each other that they could barely organize resistance. At Agincourt on October 25, 1415, Henry's small army of perhaps 9,000 men faced a French force of 20,000. It should have been an English catastrophe. Instead, it became the greatest English victory of the war. The French nobility, forgetting every lesson of Crécy and Poitiers, charged across a muddy field directly into a storm of English arrows. The battlefield became a slaughter pen. Thousands of France's greatest nobles died in the mud, trampled by their own comrades or executed by English soldiers. The Constable of France, 3 dukes, 8 counts, and an archbishop were among the dead. An entire generation of French leadership was wiped out in a single afternoon. After Agincourt, French resistance crumbled. Henry V methodically conquered Normandy, taking Rouen after a brutal siege where the defenders were reduced to eating rats and leather. The Burgundians, seeing which way the wind was blowing, allied openly with England. On September 10, 1419, during what was supposed to be a peace negotiation on the bridge at Montereau, Armagnac soldiers murdered John the Fearless in revenge for Louis of Orleans. The new Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, immediately allied with Henry V, declaring that he would rather see his sister married to the English king than make peace with his father's murderers. The Treaty of Troyes, signed on May 21, 1420, seemed to seal France's fate. Charles VI, in one of his lucid periods but under complete English and Burgundian control, disinherited his own son, the Dauphin Charles, declaring him illegitimate. Henry V would marry Charles VI's daughter Catherine, and their children would inherit both England and France. The treaty was ratified by the Estates General, giving it the color of law. France, as an independent kingdom, was scheduled for extinction. The Dauphin Charles, only 17 years old, fled south of the Loire River with the remnants of the Armagnac party. He set up a rump court at Bourges, claiming to be the legitimate heir, but few took him seriously. Even his own supporters whispered that he might indeed be illegitimate, the product of his mother Isabeau's numerous affairs. Charles himself was tormented by doubt. His father had officially disowned him. His mother had agreed to the Treaty of Troyes. Perhaps he wasn't the true heir after all. Henry V and Charles VI both died in 1422, leaving the infant Henry VI as nominal king of both England and France, with the Duke of Bedford ruling as regent. Bedford was a skilled administrator and competent general who might have succeeded in making the dual monarchy a reality. But he faced one insurmountable problem. The Dauphin Charles, despite all his weakness and self-doubt, refused to give up. The Dauphin situation by 1428 was desperate, but not quite hopeless. He controlled the territory south of the Loire River, roughly a third of France. He had the support of powerful nobles like the Duke of Alençon and the Count of Dunois. He had the theoretical legitimacy of being Charles VI's son, whatever the Treaty of Troyes might say. But he lacked the resources for a major military campaign, the confidence to assert his authority, and most critically, he lacked any sign that God favored his cause. Medieval people did not separate political and religious authority the way modern societies do. A king ruled by the grace of God. Military victory was a sign of divine favor. Defeat meant God's displeasure. The string of English victories from Crécy to Agincourt to the conquest of Normandy seemed to prove that God wanted England to rule France. The Dauphin's inability to be crowned at Reims, the traditional site where French kings received the holy oil that transformed them from mere nobles into God's anointed, meant he was not truly king at all, just a pretender clinging to a lost cause. By October 1428, the English had begun their final offensive to destroy the Dauphin's party once and for all. Their target was Orleans, the last major city north of the Loire still loyal to Charles. Orleans was more than strategically important, it was symbolically crucial. It was the city of the murdered Duke Louis, the heart of anti-Burgundian resistance. If it fell, the Loire Valley would be defenseless. The English could march on Bourges and end the war. The Siege of Orleans began on October 12, 1428, when English forces under the Earl of Salisbury arrived before the city walls. Salisbury was one of England's best generals, a veteran of dozens of campaigns. He began methodically seizing the fortified bridge over the Loire and its gatehouse, Les Tourelles, cutting the city off from the south. He built a ring of fortifications around the city, each one a small wooden fortress bristling with cannons and archers. Inside Orleans, the defenders under Jean de Dunois, the illegitimate half-brother of the murdered Duke of Orleans, prepared for a long siege. They had perhaps 2,400 soldiers and militia against 5,000 English troops. The walls were strong, the city well-provisioned, but everyone knew it was only a matter of time. Every other major siege of the war had ended the same way, eventual surrender or starvation. The one glimmer of hope came on October 27th when the Earl of Salisbury was inspecting the Les Tourelles fortress. He was standing at a window surveying the city when a cannon shot from the walls struck the window frame. A splinter of stone tore through his face, destroying one eye and lodging in his brain. He died in agony 8 days later. The English were shocked. Salisbury had survived countless battles only to be killed by a random shot. Some saw it as divine justice for attacking Orleans during the feast of Saint Aignan, the city's patron saint. But Salisbury's death only delayed the inevitable. The Earl of Suffolk took command, tightening the siege through the winter of 1428-29. Inside the city, food grew scarce. The defenders launched desperate sorties that achieved nothing except more casualties. The Dauphin sent a relief convoy in February 1429, but it was intercepted and destroyed at the Battle of the Herrings, so called because the English were defending a supply train of salted fish for Lent. The defeat at the Battle of the Herrings seemed to extinguish the last hope for Orleans. The Dauphin's court at Bourges fell into despair. Some nobles began secret negotiations with the English and Burgundians. Others simply fled to their estates to wait out the inevitable English victory. The Dauphin himself, always prone to melancholy, sank into depression. He was 26 years old, had been fighting for his inheritance for 8 years, and had nothing to show for it but a shrinking territory and a mocking nickname, the King of Bourges. It was at this moment, when French resistance was at its lowest ebb, when the kingdom that had existed since Clovis seemed about to vanish forever, that extraordinary rumors began to reach the Dauphin's court. From the eastern frontier, from a region so remote that many courtiers couldn't locate it on a map, came word of a young girl claiming that voices from heaven had commanded her to save France. She was said to be a peasant, completely uneducated, who had never traveled more than a few miles from her village. Yet she insisted that she would raise the siege of Orleans, see the Dauphin crowned at Reims, and drive the English from France. The courtiers at Bourges, sophisticated men who had spent their lives in the complex world of medieval politics, must have thought it was a joke. A peasant girl who heard voices, who claimed saints appeared to her and gave her military advice, who dressed in men's clothing and demanded to lead armies. It was absurd, impossible, perhaps blasphemous. The Dauphin had been approached by dozens of mystics and prophets claiming divine missions. Why should this one be different? But as winter turned to spring in 1429, as Orleans grew weaker and the English grew stronger, as the last hope of saving the kingdom flickered and died, some began to wonder, what if the girl was telling the truth? What if, in this darkest hour, God had finally decided to intervene? Not through a mighty prince or a learned theologian, but through the most unlikely vessel imaginable, an illiterate teenage girl from the margins of the kingdom. Meanwhile, 300 miles to the east, in a small village on the Meuse River where France, Burgundy, and the Holy Roman Empire met in an uncertain frontier, that very girl was preparing for a journey that would change everything. The summer of 1425 brought unusual heat to the Meuse Valley. In the village of Domrémy, the air hung heavy and still, broken only by the distant sound of church bells calling the faithful to prayer. It was noon, that liminal hour when the medieval world paused between the labors of morning and afternoon, when shadows disappeared and the sun stood directly overhead like the eye of God examining his creation. Joan, 13 years old, was in her father's garden behind their stone cottage. The garden was her refuge, a small plot where vegetables grew in neat rows and herbs released their fragrance into the warm air. She had been working since dawn, as she did every day, helping with the endless tasks that kept a peasant household functioning, feeding the chickens, mending clothes, preparing meals. But at noon she often found herself here, in this quiet space between the cottage and the fields, where she could be alone with her thoughts and her prayers. She would remember this moment for the rest of her short life. Every detail would remain vivid. The texture of the soil beneath her bare feet, the buzz of insects in the summer heat, the smell of growing things mixing with smoke from the village hearths. And then, suddenly, the world changed. From the direction of the church came a light brighter than the sun, though the day was cloudless. It was not the harsh light of lightning or fire, but something altogether different, a radiance that seemed to carry weight and presence, that made the very air shimmer with significance. And within that light, or perhaps composed of it, was a voice. The voice was male, authoritative but not harsh, speaking French with an accent she couldn't place, neither the local dialect of Lorraine nor the courtly French she sometimes heard from visiting nobles. The words were simple, almost mundane. Be good. Go to church. Live a worthy life. But the effect on Joan was profound. She fell to her knees, not from fear, but from recognition. Somehow, in a way she could never adequately explain, she knew this voice came from heaven. When the light faded and the voice fell silent, Joan remained kneeling in the garden, trembling, not with fear, but with a kind of electric awareness. The world looked the same, the cottage, the vegetables, the distant fields. But everything had changed. She had been touched by something beyond the ordinary flow of life, selected for reasons she couldn't yet understand. She told no one, not even her priest during confession. How could she explain what she barely comprehended herself? Over the following weeks, the voice returned, always at the hour of church bells, always accompanied by that extraordinary light. Gradually, the speaker revealed himself. He was Michael the Archangel, captain of the heavenly host, the warrior who had cast Satan from heaven, the protector of France. The choice of Michael was significant in ways Joan wouldn't fully understand until later. He was the patron saint of soldiers, the defender against evil, the one who would weigh souls at the last judgment. That he should appear to a peasant girl in an obscure village suggested something extraordinary was beginning. As autumn turned to winter and winter to spring, Michael was joined by two female saints. Saint Catherine of Alexandria appeared first, a virgin martyr who had confounded 50 philosophers with her wisdom before being executed on a spiked wheel. She was young, perhaps not much older than Joan herself appeared to be, with a voice that combined authority with compassion. Then came Saint Margaret of Antioch, another virgin martyr who had maintained her faith despite torture and temptation. Both saints were beloved in medieval France, their stories told and retold in sermons and mystery plays, their images painted in churches and carved in stone. These three, Michael the warrior, Catherine the wise, and Margaret the steadfast, would become Joan's constant companions for the rest of her life. They appeared to her 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes more during crucial periods. She saw them, she would later testify, as clearly as she saw living people. They had faces and bodies, wore crowns of gold, smelled of roses and incense. They were as real to her as her parents, more real, perhaps, because they came from a realm beyond the changes and chances of mortal life. At first the messages remained personal and spiritual. Joan must maintain her virginity, dedicating her purity to God. She must be charitable to the poor even when her own family had little to spare. She must attend Mass daily if possible, confess regularly, and receive communion with proper devotion. These were not unusual requirements. Many devout young women followed similar practices. But the supernatural source gave them special weight. Joan threw herself into religious life with an intensity that both impressed and worried her parents. She gave her own food to beggars, slept on the floor so vagrants could have her bed, spent hours in prayer when other girls her age were gossiping or dancing. The village priest, Father Jean Fournier, noticed her exceptional devotion but saw nothing heretical or dangerous in it. She was simply an extraordinarily pious girl in an age that valued piety. But as 1427 progressed, the messages from her voices began to change. They spoke less of personal holiness and more of France's suffering. They told her about battles she had never heard of, described the Dauphin she had never seen, explained political situations far beyond her experience or education. Michael showed her visions of French soldiers fleeing before English arrows, of cities burning, of the kingdom itself dissolving like salt in water. The transformation in the messages accelerated in 1428. Now the voices spoke of specific missions. Joan must go to the Dauphin Charles. She must tell him that God had sent her to help him become the true king of France. She must raise the siege of Orleans, see Charles crowned at Reims, and drive the English from French soil. The commands were precise, urgent, and completely impossible for a peasant girl to fulfill. Joan's response to these evolving messages reveals much about her character. A different person might have dismissed the voices as delusions, sought treatment for what modern medicine might diagnose as temporal lobe epilepsy or schizophrenia. Another might have embraced them as divine while recognizing the impossibility of acting on them, living a life of private mysticism without public action. But Joan possessed a quality that would define her short life: absolute certainty combined with practical determination. She began to prepare without telling anyone why. She learned to ride horses, borrowing mounts from her father's friends and teaching herself to stay seated at a gallop. She observed the men-at-arms who occasionally passed through Domrémy, studying how they moved in armor, how they held their weapons. She listened intently to news from the war, memorizing names of commanders, locations of battles, the complex web of allegiances that defined the conflict. Her father, Jacques d'Arc, began having disturbing dreams. He saw his daughter riding away with soldiers, dressed as a man, lost to shame and scandal. In the medieval world, women who followed armies had only one reputation, regardless of their actual behavior. The dreams tormented him so much that he told his sons to watch their sister carefully, threatening to drown her himself if she ever tried to run away with soldiers. Joan's internal struggle during this period must have been agonizing. She was caught between absolute certainty that God had commanded her to act and the practical impossibility of obeying. She was a minor, subject to her father's authority. She was female in a world that gave women no public voice. She was poor, uneducated, and unknown. Every structure of medieval society stood between her and the mission her voices demanded. The crisis came to a head in October 1428, when news arrived that the English had begun besieging Orleans. Joan's voices became insistent, appearing daily, sometimes multiple times a day. Catherine and Margaret wept as they described the suffering of Orleans' defenders. Michael's voice took on a tone of command that brooked no refusal. The time for preparation was over. Joan must act now, or France would be lost. It was then that Joan conceived her plan. 16 miles from Domrémy lay the fortress town of Vaucouleurs, commanded by Robert de Baudricourt, a minor noble who remained loyal to the Dauphin. If she could convince Baudricourt to listen to her, he had the authority to send her to the royal court. It was a slim chance. Why would a garrison commander pay attention to a peasant girl? But it was the only chance she had. To reach Baudricourt, Joan needed help from someone her father wouldn't suspect. She turned to Durand Laxart, her mother's cousin, a respectable farmer who lived near Vaucouleurs. She told him she needed to visit him and his wife, claiming she wanted to help with the birth of their expected child. It was the first of many deceptions she would employ, not from malice, but from necessity. The voices had commanded her to act, and she would find a way to obey, even if it meant deceiving those she loved. In January 1429, Joan arrived at her cousin's house in Boré-le-Petit, just outside Vaucouleurs. She stayed with Durand and his wife for several days, helping with household chores, giving no sign of her real purpose. Then, choosing her moment carefully, she revealed the truth to Durand. God had sent her to save France. She needed him to arrange a meeting with Robert de Baudricourt. Durand's reaction is not recorded, but we can imagine his shock. His young cousin, this girl he had known since childhood, claimed to hear voices from heaven, claimed she would save the kingdom. It must have seemed like madness. Yet something about Joan's certainty, her complete lack of doubt or hesitation, must have been compelling. Against all reason, Durand agreed to help. The first meeting with Baudricourt was a disaster. The garrison commander was a practical soldier, a minor noble who had survived decades of war through careful political maneuvering. He had no time for peasant mystics. When Durand presented Joan, and she announced that God had sent her to save France, Baudricourt's response was predictable and crude. He told Durand to take the girl home and tell her father to give her a good beating. But Joan didn't return to Domrémy. Instead, she remained in Vaucouleurs, staying with Henri and Catherine Leroyer, a local couple who were moved by her obvious devotion. She attended Mass daily at the chapel, prayed for hours, and spoke to anyone who would listen about her divine mission. Gradually, word spread through the town about the strange girl who claimed to hear voices. The people of Vaucouleurs were more receptive to Joan's message than their commander had been. They lived on the frontier of war, had seen their town besieged, their fields burned, their neighbors killed or carried off. They knew that conventional military efforts had failed, that the Dauphin's cause seemed hopeless. Perhaps God would intervene through an unlikely vessel. Hadn't he chosen David, a shepherd boy, to defeat Goliath? Hadn't he worked through Judith, a woman, to save the Israelites? An old prophecy began to circulate, attributed variously to Merlin, Bede, or Marie de Vignon. France will be lost by a woman and saved by a virgin from the marches of Lorraine. The woman who lost France was clearly Queen Isabeau, who had signed the Treaty of Troyes disinheriting her own son. Could Joan be the virgin from Lorraine who would restore what the queen had destroyed? As Joan waited in Vaucouleurs, her voices continued to guide her. They told her specific things that would happen, information she couldn't possibly have known through natural means. On February 12, 1429, she suddenly announced to the Leroyers that the Dauphin's forces had suffered a terrible defeat that very day near Orleans. The claims seemed absurd. Orleans was over 150 miles away, and no messenger could have brought news so quickly. But Joan was insistent. The French had been defeated while trying to intercept an English supply convoy. Many good men had died. When messengers arrived days later with news of the Battle of the Herrings, so called because the English had been defending a convoy of salted fish, fought on February 12th, exactly as Joan had described, the effect on Vaucouleurs was electric. The girl had known what was happening hundreds of miles away. She had seen it through divine revelation. Even skeptics began to wonder if she might be what she claimed. Jean de Metz, a young squire in Baudricourt's service, was among those intrigued by Joan. He sought her out, finding her in the chapel where she spent most of her time. His question was blunt. "What are you doing here? Must the king be driven from his kingdom and all of us become English?" Joan's answer, recorded in Jean de Metz's later testimony, was equally direct. "I have come to this royal town to speak to Robert de Baudricourt, that he might deign to take me or have me taken to the king. But he pays no attention to me or my words. Nevertheless, before mid-Lent I must be with the king, even if I must wear my legs down to the knees going to him. For no one in the world, neither kings nor dukes, nor the daughter of the King of Scotland, nor anyone else, can recover the kingdom of France. There is no help except through me, although I would prefer to stay home and spin wool with my mother, for this is not my proper station. But I must go, and I must do this, because my lord wishes me to do it." Jean de Metz was a soldier, trained to judge people quickly and accurately. His life often depended on knowing whom to trust. Something about Joan, her certainty, her lack of personal ambition, her obvious distress at being called to this mission, convinced him. He asked who her lord was. When she replied, "God," he placed his hands between hers in the futile gesture of fealty and swore to help her reach the king. Bertrand de Poulengy, another young squire, was similarly moved. Together with Jean de Metz, he began to organize an escort to take Joan to Chinon, where Charles held court. They understood the dangers involved. The journey to Chinon was over 350 miles through territory crawling with Burgundian and English patrols. A small party would have to travel at night, avoiding main roads, trusting to luck and speed to avoid capture. There was also the problem of Joan's appearance. A young woman traveling with soldiers would be assumed to be a camp follower, a prostitute. She would be in constant danger of rape or murder. The solution, proposed by Joan's voices and embraced with practical necessity, was for her to travel as a man. Jean de Metz and Bertrand de Poulengy provided her with male clothing, a tunic, hose, boots, and spurs. They cut her hair in the short pudding bowl style worn by pages. The transformation must have been shocking to those who knew Joan. In medieval society, clothing was identity. Sumptuary laws dictated what each class could wear. For a woman to dress as a man was not merely unusual but transgressive, a violation of both social norms and biblical commandments. Yet Joan accepted it as necessary for her mission. She would later say that she wore men's clothes on the command of God and would continue to do so until her mission was complete. Robert de Baudricourt, meanwhile, found himself in an increasingly difficult position. The people of Vaucouleurs had embraced Joan as a prophet. His own squires were organizing to help her. News of the girl who knew about the Battle of the Herrings had spread throughout the region. If he continued to refuse her and Orleans fell as a result, he might be blamed for ignoring a divine messenger. But if he sent her to the Dauphin and she proved to be deluded or fraudulent, he would be ridiculed. Finally, Baudricourt decided on a test. He brought the parish priest to examine Joan, to sprinkle her with holy water and command any demons to depart. Joan submitted calmly to the examination, showing no fear of the holy water or sacred words. The priest found nothing demonic about her, only exceptional piety and conviction. With no more excuses to delay, Baudricourt made his decision. On February 22, 1429, he authorized Joan to travel to Chinon. He provided her with a horse, a sword, and a formal letter of introduction to the Dauphin. His parting words, recorded by witnesses, were resigned rather than enthusiastic.